The Unwritten Pages of My Life. Chapter 1, The Diary on Shelf 7B. The smell of old paper and quiet ambition was the perfume of Eleanor Vance's life. For 30 years, she had been a librarian in the tranquil haven of the Willow Creek Public Library in a quaint historic town just outside Boston, Massachusetts. At 62, with her sensible cardigans and a perpetually serene expression, Eleanor was as much a fixture of the library as its towering oak shelves. She knew every Dewey Decimal subdivision, every whispered secret exchanged between the stacks, every unique scent of a well-loved book. Her life was orderly, predictable, and she often thought entirely her own creation. Her routine was a comforting balm. Tuesdays were for reshelving, a meticulous process she found deeply satisfying. Section 7B, encompassing memoirs and biographies, was her particular domain. It was there, nestled between a thick volume on Amelia Earhart and a lesser-known autobiography of a forgotten poet, that she found it. It wasn't a book. It was a diary. Eleanor frowned. Libraries didn't accept personal diaries as donations. Not usually. This one was bound in worn, dark blue leather, its edges soft with age, its pages secured with a small, tarnished silver clasp. It felt old, infused with unspoken stories. There was no title, no author listed anywhere. Just the plain, slightly discolored cover. Curiosity, a quiet, insistent hum she rarely indulged, pricked at her. She picked it up, feeling its unexpected weight. It was unusually heavy, as if filled with more than just paper. The clasp was slightly ajar. Impulsively, she unhooked it and carefully opened the diary. The first page was blank, save for a single, elegant cursive inscription at the very top. Property of E.M., do not read. Eleanor chuckled softly. A clear warning. But this was a library, abandoned property, and her librarian's ethics, usually so rigid, were strangely lenient today. She turned to the first entry. The handwriting was a delicate looping script, instantly captivating. The ink was faded, hinting at its age. The date at the top of the page was stark. October 17th, 1965. A familiar year. But why? Eleanor paused. She had been just a girl then, barely 8 years old, living hundreds of miles away in rural Maine. The date meant nothing to her. Or so she thought. She began to read, her breath catching as the words unfolded. October 17th, 1965. Brighton, Massachusetts. The air still smells of smoke, even now, and fear. Liam is safe. I got him out. But something happened to me. Something they don't want me to remember. The headache is splitting and my mind feels cloudy. They keep asking me what I saw. I just see flames and a face, a man's face, twisted with rage. He looked at me, and then darkness. I know him. I think, but the name is gone. My head aches from trying. My Aunt Susan says I'm confused from the concussion. But I feel like a piece of me is missing. A crucial piece. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Brighton, Massachusetts. October 17th, 1965. A fire. A child named Liam. A concussion. A missing memory. The words resonated with a terrifying familiarity. It was the exact date, the exact town, the exact circumstances. She knew this story, not from a book, not from an old news report, but from the deepest, most terrifying part of her own recently awakened memory. This was the story David Mitchell had told her just weeks ago, the story of Evelyn Marshall. the story of the Brighton High School fire, the story of the young woman who had saved Liam Mitchell, the young woman who had lost her memory after a beam struck her head, the young woman who Eleanor Vance had recently discovered was her, Eleanor Marshall, her maiden name. Eleanor Marshall, before she had moved away from Brighton, changed her name to Vance after marriage and buried that traumatic chapter deep within her subconscious. Her breath hitched, a strangled gasp in a quiet library. E.M. Eleanor Marshall. This diary, it was hers, the one she'd written in the direct aftermath of the fire, the memories she had desperately tried to cling to before they were deliberately suppressed. But she hadn't remembered writing it. She hadn't remembered any of this until David Mitchell, the brother of the child she saved, found her in Central Park, decades later. Her hands trembled so violently, the old diary threatened to slip. How could this diary, a tangible piece of her lost past, have appeared in her library, on her shelf, precisely now after all these years? It was a cosmic coincidence, a twist of fate too profound to be accidental. It was a message from herself, from a forgotten Eleanor. A cold dread mingled with a desperate, overwhelming need to read on. This wasn't just a diary. This was a direct line to the trauma she had unconsciously blocked, the truth that had been suppressed, not just by her mind, but by a deliberate act. This diary held the answers, the raw, unfiltered truth of what she saw, what she felt, before the poison, before the complete amnesia. It held the pieces of the puzzle that even David Mitchell hadn't known. She carefully, reverently, turned to the next page. This wasn't just a book she had found. This was her own unwritten past, finally revealing itself. And she was about to read the story of her own buried life. Chapter 2, Whispers from the Forgotten Self. Eleanor's fingers, almost numb with shock, traced the delicate script on the page. This wasn't just a diary, it was her diary, a direct conduit to the young woman she had been in 1965, the one who had suffered a profound trauma and then had her memory systematically erased. The scent of aged paper filled her nostrils, no longer comforting, but charged with the forgotten terror of her youth. She devoured the entries, each faded word a new revelation, a whisper from her forgotten self. October 18th, 1965. The hospital room is sterile and smells of antiseptic. My head pounds. They say I'm lucky, that Liam is lucky. They call me a hero, but I don't feel like a hero. I feel violated, like someone reached into my mind and took something. The doctor, a kind man, keeps telling me it's the concussion, but I know it's more. I saw him, that man, near the classroom. He had a can, and he looked at me. His face, so angry. I know him. He's familiar, but the name won't come. It's like a fog descends every time I try to grasp it. Aunt Susan sits by my bed, worried. She tries to get me to rest. She tells me to forget the details, just be grateful Liam is safe. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. The doctor, the kind man, had he been complicit or merely a pawn in a larger game? The anger she had felt when David first told her about the deliberate suppression of her memory solidified, crystallizing into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. It wasn't just an injury. It was a crime committed against her very consciousness. The entries continued, a harrowing chronicle of her struggle against the encroaching amnesia. October 20th, 1965. They gave me something to help me sleep. It makes my head heavy. My thoughts feel thick, like molasses. When I try to focus on the fire, on his face, it's like trying to catch smoke. It slips away. I wake up confused, Sometimes I don't even remember where I am. Aunt Susan says it's good, that I need to forget the horror. But I don't want to forget. I need to remember. He shouldn't get away with this. Liam was almost killed. Because of him. The something to help her sleep. The veiled reference in Marilyn Mitchell's letter, David's mother, about Liam's father putting something in her water. It wasn't just a theory. It was documented, right here in her own hand. A chilling, undeniable confirmation. Eleanor felt a surge of validation, mixed with a profound sorrow for the young woman who had fought so desperately to hold on to her truth, only to lose the battle. October 22nd, 1965. I overheard Aunt Susan talking to someone on the phone. She said, yes, she knows too much. We need to divert her attention. Get her out of Brighton. I don't understand. Divert my attention? From what? From remembering? The man from the fire? I almost had his name today. It was on the tip of my tongue. It starts with an M. Mark? No. Something else. Mitchell? No. Eleanor gasped. Mark. Mark Davies. Her first husband. The man who had eventually stolen her first son, David. A connection, a chilling intertwining of fates, began to form in her mind. Mark Davies, the first husband of Eleanor Vance. And Liam Mitchell's father, Daniel Mitchell, the arsonist. Was it possible? Were they connected? Or was the diary referring to Daniel Mitchell, and the name Mark was simply a tangential thought, a subconscious link to another source of trauma she had yet to recall fully? The dates, the places, her own maiden name, all pointed to a deeper, more personal connection. The entries became more erratic, the handwriting shakier, the thoughts more fragmented, reflecting the battle her young mind was fighting. November 5th, 1965. I'm leaving Brighton. Aunt Susan says it's for a fresh start. To forget the bad things. She says I'll be happier. But I feel like I'm running from something and leaving a part of myself behind. The man's face, it's a blur now. The can, just a shadow. I tried so hard to hold on to it, but it's gone. They won. Whoever they are. I don't know what I saw. I don't remember why my head hurts so much when I try. I feel empty, like a story with the most important chapter ripped out. The diary ended abruptly on that entry. No more pages were filled. The small, worn book was a monument to a forgotten struggle, a silent scream from her youth. Eleanor closed the diary, tears streaming down her face. Tears not just for the young woman in the hospital bed, but for the profound injustice she had suffered. Her amnesia wasn't just a medical consequence. It was an active suppression, a deliberate cover-up orchestrated by others. Aunt Susan's role, once seen as loving care, now appeared complicit, or at least manipulated. She reached for her phone. She needed to call David Mitchell. He was the only other person who knew this truth, who had lived with the echoes of that fire. The diary, this unexpected gift from her past, had just opened a new, terrifying, yet ultimately liberating chapter in their shared story. It held the key to understanding not just the fire, but the insidious web of secrets that had shaped both their lives. Chapter 3, The Confession of the Past. Eleanor clutched the diary, its worn leather warm against her trembling hands. The entries, a raw testament to her forgotten struggle, had ripped open wounds she hadn't known existed. The phone call to David Mitchell, when it finally came, was urgent, almost frantic. David, Eleanor's voice was hoarse, thick with emotion. "It's Eleanor. I found something. Something impossible." There was a pause, then David's familiar, gentle voice. "Eleanor, what is it? You sound distressed." "The diary, David. My diary from 1965. It appeared in my library, here in Willow Creek. It's written by E.M., and it's my story, every detail you told me, and more. It talks about the concussion, the blank spaces, the attempts to make me forget." David's gasp was audible. "Your diary after all these years? That's incredible, Eleanor." "And terrifying. What does it say?" Eleanor recounted the diary's chilling entries, reading snippets aloud, her voice trembling with each revelation. When she reached the part about Aunt Susan's phone call, "She knows too much." David let out a low groan. "My mother suspected your aunt," David confessed, his voice heavy. "Not of malice, but of being pressured. My father, Daniel, was a very persuasive, very dangerous man when he was desperate. He was also incredibly cunning. He was capable of threats, of manipulation. He knew your aunt was protective of you and that she was also, perhaps, a bit easily intimidated, especially when it came to his money or his connections." Eleanor felt a wave of cold understanding. Aunt Susan, always so proper and concerned with appearances, likely had been coerced, threatened into silence, or simply convinced by Daniel Mitchell that Evelyn was unstable and needed to forget. It didn't make it right, but it explained the cryptic entry. "The diary mentioned a name," Eleanor continued, her voice tight. "A name starting with M. I thought it said Mark at one point, but then it was a blur. Do you know anything about my first husband, Mark Davies?" David was silent for a long moment. "Mark Davies," he repeated, a strange note in his voice. "That name, it does ring a bell. I remember my mother, Marilyn, mentioning him once. Years after the fire, she said something about him knowing Daniel, my father, that they had history, business dealings, I think. Something shady. She never elaborated, but she seemed very disturbed by it. She warned me to stay away from anyone connected to my father's past, especially after his disappearance." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The pieces of her shattered life began to click into place with terrifying precision. Mark Davies, Daniel Mitchell, not just a coincidence, a connection. "This is why my memory was so thoroughly suppressed, David," Eleanor whispered, a chilling realization dawning on her. It wasn't just about the fire. It was about what I saw and who was connected. My first husband, Mark, was involved somehow, and my losing David, my first son, was that also part of this? Was it a punishment? A way to silence me completely? Her voice broke. "We need to find out," David said, his voice firm, resolute. "This diary, it's more than just your lost past, Eleanor. It's a key to understanding everything. My mother's torment, my father's full depravity, your suffering, and perhaps even the true fate of your son, David Davies, and how this diary appeared in your library now. That's a mystery in itself." Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about healing her own past. It was about seeking justice, understanding the full scope of the darkness that had haunted both their lives. Over the next few days, Eleanor meticulously reread the diary, cross-referencing names and dates with what David had told her. She used the library's resources, delving into old newspaper archives, both digital and microfiche, from the Boston area. She found reports of the Brighton High fire, all consistent with the story David told, but none mentioned a potential arsonist or her name as the rescuer. The official narrative remained undetermined. Then she found a series of alarming reports from the late 1960s, predating her marriage to Richard Vance and her move to Oregon. They were articles about a local Boston area loan sharking and extortion ring being investigated by the FBI, and one name prominently featured in those reports, a minor player who mysteriously vanished before he could be indicted, Daniel Mitchell. And in one peripheral mention, a short, almost throwaway line about his associates, Mark Davies, a former business partner. Eleanor gasped, her hands shook. Clutching the printout from the microfiche reader, it was true. Mark Davies and Daniel Mitchell were indeed connected. They had been partners in crime. This wasn't just a fire and a lost memory. This was an organized criminal enterprise, and she, a young, innocent woman, had stumbled upon its dark underbelly. Her memory, now fully unlocked by the diary and her research, clicked into place. The night Mark took David from her, after she tried to leave. He hadn't just been drunk and abusive. He had been terrified that she knew something, that she could expose him or Daniel Mitchell. Taking David from her was not just an act of control, it was a punishment, a silencing. A way to ensure she was too broken, too lost to ever fight back or reveal what she knew. And then, when she disappeared, assuming a new identity, they likely thought she was gone for good. The diary appearing now, a cosmic intervention. But how? Who could have placed it there? It was too perfectly timed, too precise. She had to find out. This diary wasn't just a gift from her past. It was a weapon for truth. Chapter 4. A Guardian of the Pages. The revelation of the criminal connection between Daniel Mitchell and Mark Davies hit Eleanor with a sickening thud. Her entire life, it seemed, had been shaped by a network of lies, fear, and dark secrets, spun by men she had once trusted. The diary, this small, unassuming book, had just blown open a 50-year-old cold case, a chilling conspiracy that went far beyond a single fire. She called David again, her voice grim as she relayed her findings. Daniel Mitchell wasn't just an arsonist, David. He was involved in organized crime. And Mark was his partner. David was silent for a long moment, the weight of the revelation heavy between them. My mother, she never told me the full extent, he finally said, his voice strained. She just said his business was dangerous. That's why she feared him so much, even after he disappeared. She worried he'd come back, or that his associates would. And they came for me, David, Eleanor whispered, a chilling certainty settling over her. Not physically, but they used Mark. They used my vulnerability to ensure I lost my son, David, my first son, to ensure I was too broken to ever piece this together. The conversation turned to the diary itself, its miraculous appearance. It felt like destiny or something more. How did it get here, Eleanor? David asked, his voice puzzled. A diary written in Brighton, decades ago, somehow ending up in a library outside Boston, exactly when you need it. Eleanor had been thinking about this. The library had a robust donation system, but they typically didn't accept personal items without proper cataloging. This diary had simply appeared on the shelf, as if placed there by an unseen hand. There's one person who handles all the book donations, Eleanor said slowly, a thought beginning to form. A retired archivist, Mrs. Gable. She's been volunteering here for years. She has an encyclopedic memory for every book that's ever passed through these doors. If anyone knows how this diary got here, it's her. The next morning, Eleanor approached Mrs. Gable's desk, her heart pounding with anticipation. Mrs. Gable, a spry woman in her late 70s, with spectacles perched on her nose and a smile perpetually crinkling her eyes, looked up warmly. "Eleanor, dear, what can I do for you?" "Mrs. Gable, I need to ask you about a very specific item, a small blue leather diary. No title, just EM inscribed inside. It recently appeared on shelf 7B. Mrs. Gable's eyes widened slightly, and her smile faltered. A flicker of something, recognition, apprehension, crossed her face. "Ah, yes," she said, her voice softer than usual. "The little blue book. I was wondering when you might notice it." Eleanor stared. "You put it there, didn't you?" Mrs. Gable sighed, a deep, weary sound. She looked around, as if to ensure no one was listening, then leaned in closer. "Come to my office, Eleanor. This isn't a conversation for the main desk." In Mrs. Gable's small, cluttered office, filled with stacks of old records and the scent of forgotten papers, the older woman sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "My real name, Eleanor," Mrs. Gable began, her voice a hushed whisper, "is Marilyn Mitchell." Eleanor gasped, her jaw dropping. Marilyn Mitchell, David's mother? The woman whose letter had confessed the truth of the arson and the memory suppression. The woman who had urged David to find her. Mrs. Gable nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, I'm Marilyn, Daniel's wife, Liam and David's mother. I took on a new identity after Daniel disappeared. He had dangerous connections, and I needed to protect my boys. I chose a new life, far away from Brighton, away from the constant fear. I settled here, in Willow Creek. It felt safe, and I could be near a library. Books were my solace." Eleanor stared, speechless. Marilyn Mitchell, David's mother, the source of the letter, the reason David found her, and now, the woman who had brought her own diary back to her. The diary. Marilyn continued, her voice trembling. "I kept it. I found it in your belongings after you moved out of Aunt Susan's house, after Daniel had tampered with your memory. You had left it behind. I knew what you had written. I knew you had seen Daniel. I knew he had tried to erase it. I kept it safe, hidden away. It was my only proof of what he had done to you, my silent penance." "But why now?" Eleanor asked, tears streaming down her face. "Why bring it to me now, after all these years?" Marilyn's gaze was filled with a profound sorrow, yet also a fierce determination. "I've been battling cancer, Eleanor, for the last 2 years. The doctors say there isn't much time left. I wrote that letter to David, urging him to find you, to tell you everything, because I knew I was running out of time. But I also knew that a letter might not be enough, that you might not believe him without solid proof. And then, a few months ago, I saw you. Here, in the library. My heart stopped. Eleanor had been unaware. She had seen Mrs. Gable, the kind volunteer, countless times, but never suspected. I realized it was you, Eleanor Marshall," Marilyn continued, her voice growing stronger. "The brave young woman who saved my son, the woman my husband so cruelly silenced. I knew then that fate had brought you here, to my sanctuary, to my final act of atonement. I needed to give you your story back, the tangible proof. I waited for the right moment, for you to be ready. I knew David had found you. I saw him in the park weeks ago. He visited me shortly after, and I knew It was time for you to reclaim your truth. Marilyn Mitchell, the quiet librarian, the secret keeper, the haunted mother, had orchestrated this final, profound act of justice and healing. She had been the guardian of Eleanor's unwritten pages, patiently waiting for the opportune moment to return them. To complete the cycle of truth, the diary wasn't just a random discovery. It was a deliberate act of profound courage and desperate atonement. And Eleanor, holding the diary, finally understood the true depth of the cosmic coincidence that had brought her lost past and her forgotten self back into her hands. Chapter 5. The Full Truth and Forgiveness. The revelation that Mrs. Gable, the kind, unassuming library volunteer, was in fact Marilyn Mitchell, David's mother and the silent guardian of Eleanor's past, sent a dizzying ripple through Eleanor's carefully ordered world. The sheer, improbable convergence of fate, the decades-long secret held by the woman she saw almost daily, was staggering. Yet, as Marilyn spoke, detailing her quiet life in Willow Creek, her reasons for taking on a new identity, her deep regret, and her terminal illness, Eleanor felt not anger, but a profound, overwhelming wave of compassion. "I didn't want to die with this secret, Eleanor," Marilyn said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper, as if a great weight had lifted from her frail shoulders. "I tried to tell David the full story in that letter, hoping he'd find you. But I knew your diary. It was the real key. It was your voice, your truth, preserved." She coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "I needed you to know, from your own words, that you weren't just amnesiac, that you were a victim, and that you deserved to remember. You deserved justice." Eleanor reached across the cluttered desk and took Marilyn's hand, clasping it tightly. "Thank you, Marilyn," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for keeping it safe, for bringing it back to me. You've given me back more than just a memory. You've given me back my identity." Over the next few weeks, Eleanor spent countless hours with Marilyn in her small, tidy home, filled with the scent of lavender and old books. Marilyn, with her fading strength, filled in the final, agonizing gaps in the story. She confirmed the full extent of Daniel Mitchell's criminal enterprise, his connections to dangerous figures, including Mark Davies, Eleanor's first husband. She explained how Daniel, fearing exposure, had not only tampered with Eleanor's memory, but had also subtly manipulated Mark, feeding his paranoia and abusive tendencies, encouraging him to take David away from Eleanor completely. It was a cruel, brilliant strategy, silence the witness by making her too broken, too consumed by personal tragedy, to ever pursue the truth. Marilyn confessed her own agonizing complicity, the fear for her sons' lives, the threats from Daniel. She spoke of the lifelong burden of guilt she carried, her only solace found in watching her sons grow, and in her quiet life of atonement, working among books. The decision to place the diary on Eleanor's shelf, knowing Eleanor worked there, was a final act of profound courage, a desperate plea for forgiveness and justice as her own life ebbed away. Eleanor also spoke to David Mitchell frequently, sharing the astonishing revelation of his mother's true identity and her final act. David, initially stunned, then overwhelmed with emotion, expressed a profound admiration for his mother's strength and atonement. He flew to Willow Creek, reuniting with Eleanor and spending precious final days with his mother, offering her forgiveness and comfort she had craved for decades. The three of them, bound by a shared, traumatic past, found the profound, unexpected healing in their truth. When Marilyn Mitchell, known to the community as Mrs. Gable, passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by Eleanor and David, there was a sense of profound grief, but also of peace. She had finally unburdened herself, ensuring the truth would live on. Eleanor, armed with the diary, Marilyn's full confession, and David's corroboration, finally took the boldest step. She approached the local authorities, then the FBI, laying out the meticulous evidence of the 50-year-old cold case, the arson, the criminal connections, the memory suppression, and the devastating impact on her life and the life of her first son, David Davies. The diary, a physical testament from the past, was undeniable. The investigation was reopened. While Daniel Mitchell was long gone, likely deceased, and Mark Davies had also vanished without a trace years ago, the evidence Eleanor presented was compelling. The truth, long buried, finally had its day. The official records of the Brighton High fire were updated, correcting the narrative from undetermined to arson. Eleanor Marshall was formally recognized as the brave young woman who saved Liam Mitchell, her heroism finally acknowledged without the shadow of the suppressed truth. Eleanor, her past finally untangled and validated, found a new sense of purpose. She began volunteering more extensively at the library, not just reshelving, but creating local history archives, helping others piece together their own family stories. She spoke to community groups, not about sensationalism, but about the enduring power of truth, the resilience of the human spirit, and the courage it takes to confront one's past. Her relationship with David Mitchell deepened into a cherished, lifelong friendship. They often met, sometimes in New York, sometimes in Portland, sometimes simply chatting on the phone. Two souls bound by an extraordinary shared history. They spoke of Liam, who still didn't know the full, darkest truth of his father's actions, a truth David chose to keep from him to protect his peace, knowing that Eleanor had finally received hers. Eleanor Vance, once Eleanor Marshall, her identity split and fragmented by trauma and deceit, was finally whole. The diary, a forgotten echo from her youth, had not just reappeared on a library shelf. It had rewritten her life, transforming a narrative of suppressed pain into a profound story of discovery, courage, and the liberating power of truth. The unwritten pages of her life were now fully, courageously, and beautifully written.